Hi guys, welcome to the WCC Ag Greenhouses. I'm going to take you on a short tour today to kind of showcase plant physiology and diversity. So let's go. First up on our tour are the Bryophytes. These are non-vascular plants. They completely lack tissues that allow them to transport water, so they generally tend to be very small, very prostrate, and almost always in extremely moist areas. So this little guy, this liverwort, popped up in our aquaponics system. So a spore floated over, took hold, and was able to produce this lobed photosynthetic tissue, which is not a true leaf, nor do these have true roots. They do, however, have rhizoids. If you look on the underside, you can kind of see them here. And that just sort of allows the plant to anchor itself in place. And now we're going to move on into our vascular plants, the tracheophytes. And all of the plants that go on from here have conductive tissues that transport water and nutrients throughout the plant. This particular plant here is an equisetum, and it can be hydrophytic or mesophytic. Hydrophytic meaning it grows in moisture, so here it is growing in moisture, or mesophytic meaning it can grow in soil with moderate moisture levels. Typically in the wild you tend to see these guys around rivers, creeks, and streams. And what's really interesting about these is that they have these hollow stem segments with these itty bitty tiny non-photosynthetic leaves. So those little brown parts that circle it, those are the true leaves. And these plants are really high in silica in their stems, so they were formerly known as scouring rushes, though they are not rushes, which settlers used to scrub out metal pots and pans. Moving on into ferns, we have the rabbit's foot fern, which is an epiphyte, meaning it grows on substrates that are not soil. So these can be found growing on the trunks and branches of trees and rocky outcroppings. And this particular plant has specialized fuzzy rhizomes. You can see there's little leaves coming off this. And that allows the plant to effectively spread and grow out from the original growing point. And these have highly divided fronds with pinnules and pinnae. They're absolutely lovely to look at. Another epiphytic fern we have is the kangaroo paw fern. Here you can see one of its rhizomes kind of jumping out from the center. And they have fronds on a single leaf. These are not pinnate because, as you can see, there is no discontinuity at the midrib. And I just wanted to point out this really cool arrangement of spores on the undersides of the leaves. So ferns are spore producing plants, and this variety, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, holds its spores in a sori, and these will be gradually released from the plant and they will find a moist spot and make a whole new one. This is one of my favorite epiphyte ferns. This is known as a staghorn fern, which is named for the antler-shaped fronds that it has. So these ferns grow at the base here, and they grow a shield-like structure which gradually enlarges and dries over time. And that shield protects its roots from desiccation, especially growing up really high in trees. And their spore arrangements are so unusual. So this whole underside here, really all along the tips of the leaves, is where they produce spores. And these can get really huge. There's one at the UC Davis greenhouses that's probably 4 feet by 4 feet. Moving on in our vascular plants are the gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are non-flowering, seed-producing plants, and we generally tend to know them best from pines and spruce and cedar and all those guys. But there are a few within that family that we have here who are less than typical. So this is from the group called Cycads, which are an ancient lineage of plants. This is a sago palm, and like all gymnosperms, they They are neither dicots or monocots, and a family characteristic of these is that they generally rely on wind rather than animals for pollination. Another family feature of this group is that they tend to be dioecious, which basically translates to two houses, meaning one plant will be male, one plant will be female. This one hasn't flowered at all, so, well, not flowered. It hasn't produced a reproductive structure at all, so I am unsure as to the gender. And these leaves are pinnate, narrow, and very stiff. Moving further into gymnosperms, we have Ginkgo biloba. I would do this outside, but the weather's really crappy, so I just grabbed a couple leaves for reference. And I remember being really surprised to find out these were gymnosperms because, again, I expect pines and even with cycads and those really incredibly narrow, stiff, tough leaves, whereas ginkgo do not have those. However, like all gymnosperms, they do not flower, but they do produce seeds. And ginkgo are what we would refer to as an evolutionary anachronism. It's almost like a ghost. It's the last member of its genus, and it used to rely on certain animals to disperse seeds. These evolved around 200 million years ago when the world was dominated by dinosaurs. And the fruit that surrounds the seed gives off butyric acid, so it smells like vomit. So you can imagine, like, these seed dispersing mechanisms were probably carried around by carrion eaters, things that really enjoyed the smell of rotting, nasty crap. So these leaves are fan-shaped, and if you look, it's more distinct in this particular one, that lobe there. So ginkgo biloba means two lobes, so it looks almost as though each leaf has two lobes. Moving right along in our tour, we come to the angiosperms. So angiosperms are flowering plants. They produce flowers, which then go on to produce seeds. And we're going to first cover monocots, meaning one true seed leaf. Now, this is always very apparent when plants are extremely young and they produce one single baby leaf from the seed. However, it gets pretty difficult to tell what it is if it's not a baby. So one of the features of this group is that they have veins in the leaf that are parallel to each other. And they also have flower parts in numbers of threes or multiples of threes. So looking here at this orchid, this is an epiphytic oncidium, and it produces these really interesting pseudobulbs. So these are not true bulbs because they are growing above ground, but they are still a storage organ. They are a modified stem. And when you go ahead and look at these really incredible flowers, you will see what is kind of designated as multiples of three. So this lower part here, this is a highly modified petal called a labellum, and the two right off the sides are the two other petals, and then these three structures in the back are its sepals. So multiples of three, and they store their pollen in special sacs, so when the pollen is attached to an insect, it all goes at once. Another epiphytic monocot is Spanish moss. These are pretty prevalent in the American tropics. They grow off of tree limbs, often in highly humid, moist environments. So they are covered in these little itty-bitty tiny trichomes that allow them to absorb water from their environment without needing root structures. Next we have lemongrass, and this is a very classic appearance for monocots grasses. And lemongrass is super rich in secondary metabolites, specifically citrals, which to us are delicious. For the plant, they are a form of protection, and they actually kill the hell out of insects, fungi, and some bacteria. But these citrals are also really tasty, and they contain the potential for use in integrated pest management scenarios where they can be used as an alternative to phosphine and other fumigants commonly used in dry storage of grain products. Also, they're huge. Next we have our Sansevieria trifasciata, which is a succulent-leaved xerophyte. These plants are specially adapted towards very, very dry conditions. So these leaves and the cuticles on them are extremely thick, which allows them to resist dehydration. And they grow generally as a floret, although we just pruned it, so it's a little hard to tell. And they're really easy to propagate. You can take just a little chunk of leaf and stick it in some soil, and within a few weeks you will have new roots. They're an extremely popular houseplant, and they are highly tolerant of what I call starvation conditions. So if you put it in deep shade, it won't die right away. Another monocot in our collection is the spider plant. A lot of people are very familiar with spider plants. They're a super easy to grow house type plant that possesses stolons, which are these long stem-like structures that allow the plant to vegetatively reproduce. So each one will produce a new set of roots, a new set of leaves, and accordingly allow the plant to clone itself. Coming up next, we have Monstera deliciosa. And Monstera are what we hemi hemi-epiphytes, meaning they at some point in their life cycle grow in soil and at some other point in their life cycle grow on trees. And they do this with aerial roots, which you can kind of see wrapped around the side of the pot here, that allows them to anchor themselves extremely well and continue growing either upwards or downwards. And you may be noticing these holes in the leaves. So we call these fenestrations. And fenestrations are a really interesting adaptation for large leaves. So in this case, it allows water to fall through the leaf and for wind to blow through the leaf without damaging it. And it's just absolutely beautiful to look at. What a cool adaptation. Our next and potentially surprising monocots are bananas. So we typically see bananas in the store, the common yellow variety called Cavendish. And most of those are from the same individual plant. So while there may be thousands and thousands of acres of bananas in the tropics, those have all been vegetatively reproduced and cloned due to the fact that these hybrid bananas do not produce seeds. And one of the interesting things, and it's not as prevalent as I would like because we are in greenhouse conditions, which are pretty friendly, but if you look closely, you'll notice that these leaves have essentially a really high tendency for these linear breaks, and these occur in the wild especially all along the leaf margins, and this also allows wind to pass through the leaf without damaging it inexorably or tearing it straight off the plant. Moving on from monocots are the dicots. So these baby plants would have 2 true seed leaves, and then moving on into older age, the leaves of these plants would have veins that are branched and flower parts that are in multiples of 4s or 5. So I wanted to look at this echinocactus, the barrel cactus, and point out a couple interesting features of this dicot. So that green part is the stem, and it's extremely waxy to help prevent dehydration. And the leaves, this is a terrible example for dicot leaves, the leaves are actually these spines. These spines are modified leaves, so those are true leaves, but they have just been highly modified to no longer photosynthesize and instead provide the plant with really intense protection. If you ever go walking out in the desert, do not wear sandals. Moving on within the dicot family are the true succulents, most of which are xeric adapted and have special photosynthetic qualities we refer to as CAM photosynthesis. I will let your professors torture you with that. This is a stapelia, which I'm so sad is not in bloom, so I'll throw up a picture or a short clip of it blooming a few months back. And the flowers are 5-petaled, They are designed or have evolved in concert with flies, so they smell really nasty and attract fly pollinators. And most of these have specialized adaptations that allow them to resist extremely dry environments. So that may come with special pigments that allow them to keep their chlorophyll from burning, or it may come in the form of extremely waxy cuticles, really prostrate growing habits, and long spines that provide some shade throughout parts of the day. Next in our dicots, we have Calathea or Calathea. I don't know, potato. It's one of those words I only ever read. I never hear people say out loud, so correct me if I am wrong. And this is a pretty diverse group of plants. They are hydrophytes, meaning they grow in shady, moist conditions. And one of my favorite features of this entire group is that they all have these red undersides on their leaves. And these are actually highly specialized low light adaptations. So very, very little light is coming down and hitting this leaf. And what does can bounce off of this red underside and back into the leaf tissue, which allows these plants to really resist the potential for starvation in low light environments. Our next dicot is the sensitive mimosa, which are one of my favorites for a lot of different reasons. So first of all, they have bipinnate compound leaves, which just scream, touch me. However, these plants have extremely specialized adaptations to that very habit of mine, as well as insects, where they can move in real time to prevent leaf predation. So they display two types of movement. One is folding of their pinnules, which I will show you. So amazing, watch. Come on. Okay, they must be sleepy. But as you can see, it's beginning to fold up. The other movement they have is dropping, which is at the petiole here. And if I touch it enough, it should cooperate. Or not. Come on. There it goes. And all of this movement occurs through the action potential of the plant tissue, which is where there's movement of ions across the cell membrane that cause the water-filled vacuoles in the cell to quickly lose water and allow these plants to essentially move without anything like muscle tissue. They're just super cool. Now I'm just going to poke the hell out of it to show you guys kind of how amazing they are. Poke, 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 poke. There we go. Awesome. Moving right along, we get into the extremely exciting part, I think, which are the carnivorous plants. All the varieties here are North American. They grow in the Carolinas, and they typically grow in bogs of peat. So these soils, if you could call them that, are extremely low in nutrients, especially nitrogen, and full of rain-based moisture. So they're extremely acidic conditions, and these plants are highly specialized to exploit this niche that most other plants cannot grow in. And first and foremost is the always popular Dionaea, the Venus flytraps. I believe that both the varieties we have are hybrids, and being from the East Coast, they are supposed to go dormant, which is why they're outside right now. This guy hasn't fallen asleep yet, but if I were to just reach out and touch this part, you notice like the plant does not react at all. However, if I take this handy dandy stick and I touch one of these hairs more than once, way more than once apparently, ooh, the trap slams shut. These hairs are not indiscriminate, so they do need to be activated more than once, and they have to be continuously activated once the trap closes. So if a piece of a stick, in this case, touched it, the plant wouldn't be fooled into digesting it. And then these pitcher type plants that we have are in the Sarracenia genus, and their modifications also allow them to trap and digest insects as a source of fertilizer. And it's a little bit difficult to tell on these varieties, but this lip of the plant is extremely slippery, and all along the inside are downward facing hairs that essentially prevent insects that fell in from coming back out. And if we pull up this cap and look down there, you can see a crap load of stuff at the bottom that's slowly being digested and harvested for its nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So they're about to go dormant. This is typical for North American varieties. They'll fall asleep and they will wake back up in spring, ready to start a new year. There are lots of other carnivorous plants outside of North America as well, and this is the one variety we have, the Nepenthes pitcher plant. I think it's an important point to note that between the Sarracenias, the Dioina, and these Nepenthes, while these are all carnivorous plants, they've all evolved independently, meaning they don't have a common ancestor with each other. So carnivory is a great example of convergent evolution, where all these plants in these low nutrient environments have been forced to come up with similar adaptations that allow them to exploit the few bits of nutrients in their environment, which are insects. So the Nepenthes are really, really cool to look at. You can see this edge to this highly modified leaf, which has a little cap. This one's beginning to die back, that generally help keep rainwater out. And I'm not sure if this one's really caught anything or not, but it's worth looking at. And so an insect would fall in there, and the plant will pump its own water and digestive enzymes into this and essentially allow itself to partake. These are different from our Sarracenias, which are rhizomatous. The Nepenthes generally tend to be vining plants, and you can see it's beginning to form a new extension. And then along these leaves, you can see they start out at the stem like most plants, but then they develop this unusual structure that I don't know the name of, that gradually forms these really incredibly beautiful pitchers. I just think they're amazing. Further along in the dicot group, we have coffee Eradica. Please forgive me for how sad this plant looks. It hates me, because coffee actually requires really specific growing conditions. They are a tropical highland plant, so while they have lots of moisture and humidity, the areas in which they grow along hills and mountains are not hot. Additionally, they're highly sensitive to any sort of like surface water that you or I may use in our tap, and I've been out of rainwater for a few months, so it's just pissed at me in general. But an important point to note about these tropical highland climates is that they continue to get warmer with climate change, and as climate change continues to increase, very specifically nighttime high temperatures, our coffee supply is extremely threatened. Anyway, looking at the leaf physiology, they're a pretty typical looking plant, and they have a sort of bipolar leaf structure with ovate leaves that have an entire undulate leaf margin. Yay, I remembered something. And the last plant that I wanted to show you guys is Plumeria. This is an extremely popular tropical plant for scents and for their 5-petaled flowers, which women commonly wear behind their ears when they go to fancy places like Hawaii. So these have really thick, succulent trunks. They cannot take freezes at all, or this entire thing will freeze back and the plant will die. And they have a clustered alternate leaf arrangement at the branch end. Anyway, that is it for this tour. Thank you all so much for watching.